Hello, my name is Vijay Rajkumar. I am a Master of Architecture student, and I'm here today representing MIT NOMAS. That is the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students, who've organized today's lecture, an annual part of the Department of Architecture's Spring Lecture Series. Welcome to Long Lounge, to those of us here in person with us, as well to those of us joining us online through the live stream. As with all public events at MIT, I'll begin before introducing our event and speaker today with the Institute's land acknowledgement statement. MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is traditionally unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. We, the members of NOMAS, are committed to the idea that our community can be strengthened by the active practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the Department of Architecture. As a group of students, we aim to provide a source of support and camaraderie through communal gathering, open discourse, and lasting mentorship, while challenging misconceptions surrounding minority representation and emphasizing the importance of diverse communities through dialogue with the institution and people of MIT. Lecture series highlighting minority designers and researchers, open letters, and advocacy. We're also a group of friends who gather weekly for coffee and donuts in Killian Court. For the past several years, NOMAS has had the opportunity to invite a guest of our choosing each year to be a part of the department's lecture series. Last year, we were joined virtually by Joseph Kunkel, a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation and director of Mass Design Group's Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Today, which marks almost exactly 2 years since the day we received that fateful email sending us all home into that period of isolation with an indefinite conclusion, we are so lucky to be here together again in Long Lounge. Today, as much as any other, but in particular, this precise moment of transition and change around the world, in Cambridge, in architecture, we must be thinking critically about the voices we want to continue to define architecture by, and those we'd like to bring closer into the conversation to produce stronger, more vibrant, more culturally relevant proximities, which will inform a sense of what architecture is and what it may become. So with our opportunity to bring one of those voices we admire from outside the discipline, to take a pause in our regularly scheduled programming and see what emerges in the break, we are privileged and honored to be joined today by the poet, writer, and cultural theorist Fred Moten. Fred Moten works in the departments of performance studies and comparative literature at New York University. His latest book, with Stefano Harney, is All Incomplete, published by Minor Composition and Etana Media in 2021. I'll also add that he is also the author of several other books, including In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, which investigates the connections between jazz, sexual identity, and radical Black politics. The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning, and Black Study, also authored with Stefano Harney. And the trilogy of collected writings, which was my personal introduction to Fred's work, Consent Not to Be a Single Being, which includes poetic reflections on art, music, and social life, interweaving a wide range of disciplines, including, but not limited to, Black studies, performance studies, jazz history, critical theory, and visual art. Fred's writing resonates strongly with our interests as a group of students in NOMAS, who often find ourselves in the unusual context of institutions like MIT, somewhat exactly where we are expected to be and simultaneously out of place. We are grateful and excited to have you with us today. I have a final administrative matter before handing the floor to Fred. After the lecture, there'll be a time for questions. If you're watching online, please feel free to post your questions through the comments on the live webcast portal or on Facebook Live. For our in-person audience members, please use the microphone stand at the front of the room to ask questions. We will get to as many questions as we can, and that'll be moderated by Jola and Justin in the corner of the room. Thank you. Fred, the floor is yours. Okay, thanks. Okay.
Thank you, Vijay, very much. And I just want to thank Aiden and Jola and just everybody who is responsible for me being here. It's a pleasure and an honor, and I wish I had. Well, there's the kind of typical academic disclaimer of what's about to happen, which I never can seem to not do. It's sort of bad. I don't want to say it's bad faith, but it's certainly bad form. You shouldn't go someplace thinking already that what you have is so whack that you have to apologize for it beforehand. But let me count the reasons why I should apologize. So the first is just, a little bit of nervousness and fear. I was trying to, have I ever written anything about architecture? And I know you want to change the pace, so, and yet it feels like, well, I should say something about architecture. And I was trying, do I have anything to say about architecture? I think I almost do, but it's a almost do. So so it feels like it's not quite there yet. And I'm also apologizing for what I assure you and all the science that I have at my disposal should assure you is a perfectly meaningless and harmless cough. But at the same time, I can't seem to get rid of it. I can't get past it. But it's gonna bother me, but it won't bother you, I promise. I was, so as a part of the prefatory statement is that I really have spent, a long time, 35 years at least, sort of really almost having a kind of a worshipful attitude towards art. And I'm thinking about architecture here now under that rubric, which might not be right. And if it's not right, it's probably a really good thing insofar as I've totally lost my religion about art in the last few years. It's an interesting thing to be able to fall back on what one might think of as the practicalities of architecture, because I've had such a deep investment, let's say, in poetry, and a huge part of that investment really had to do with the way in which it seemed necessarily and happily to avoid practicality, right? That in some ways, my faith in it and my belief in it had to do with the fact that it resisted being put to use within a brutal economy of use, right? And now I'm beginning to think that, well, no, it had been put to use all along, and in these, relatively venal ways. And so the question is not a question concerning the difference between that which escapes being put to use and that which is put to use, but rather, how can something be put to use, and what kind of use can it be put to? And so those are the questions that I've been asking myself. Maybe the thing to do would be to keep this talk as brief as possible so that I can begin to ask these questions of you. My sense of it is that you've had a much more direct relationship to them than I have, and I'm a kind of latecomer to the question of practicality. But I'm eager to learn. Okay. Anyway, so there's a sort of itinerary. I got about 25, 30 more minutes to go. And what I wanted to do was to read one poem that connects up to this interest I have in the word project, and that then might hopefully end up veering towards the questions and lessons that I have been also asking and thinking about, specifically with regard to the great Nigerian musician, or I don't know if that's even the right descriptor. I don't know if he would be proud or happy to be named by way of and I'll talk about that too in a little while, but the great musician Fela Kuti. So those are the sort of three stops I want to make, and hopefully we'll see what happens. Okay, so a short story. So about, I guess it was 2000, the fall, late summer of 2000, I think 2013. And I was invited by the artist, oh man, I'm forgetting his first name, Thomas Hirschhorn, the sort of Swiss artist, to participate in this long sort of ongoing project that he had developed in relation to, called the Gramsci Monument. And it was a project that was built on the grounds of the forest homes in the South Bronx in New York City. And if you're familiar with, Hirschhorn has done a number of these projects, these monuments. There's a Wittgenstein monument and a Deleuze monument. He's interested in building these sorts of social spaces, but he's adamant and always adamant about calling them works of art. But these social spaces, usually in public housing projects, was the Deleuze monument, I think, was in the banlieue outside of Paris. But he builds these monuments, which are really these sort of living, almost sort of organic social spaces that, in this instance, it included a restaurant, a little museum that actually included Gramsci memorabilia, and there were platforms. It was almost as if a kind of variation on an ark had been built in the yard of these projects in the South Bronx. And I remember being extraordinarily wary about it. It felt like it was always bordering, always sort of about to get over the edge into a kind of romanticism, or a kind of maybe even like extractivism, you never get involved in something and you want it to be good and you kind of think it might be good, but you're not sure, and you don't want to be caught up in it in a certain kind of way. But I had agreed to do it, and I read a lot about his work. I was really interested in what he was doing, but I was still skeptical. And my skepticism, it was sponsored by the Dia Art Foundation, just this big sort of art world thing in New York City. And they flew me out there from Los Angeles, where I was living at that time. And I remember it was I'll tell you exactly, it was the day that the New York City Police Department's pledge to stop and frisk was supposed to go into effect. So the DAR Foundation put me up in this fancy apartment just below Houston Street in Soho that they own, I guess, right? So I got there, and I'm sitting in this apartment and, waiting for the next day. I went and got myself something to eat, and I came back into the apartment, and I went up to the elevator and opened the door and went in, and 2 minutes later, it was NYPD, right? So somebody who lived in the building had called the police because this, because some stranger, me, was walking in the elevator. So I'm like, and they came in, they started asking me for ID. I was trying to find a letter on my computer from the Dia Foundation that had invited me, and I started getting mad, you know, and then they started getting mad, and then I was like, okay, let me not get shot up in here, you know, on my way to give a talk at the fucking Gramsci Monument, right? And but I was in a certain kind of a mood the next day when they picked me up in the limousine, you know, to go up to the Gramsci Monument. And so I was even more skeptical, right? And I figured I had to tell them about it, you know, because it was this apartment and all stuff. And you know, and the people, they were pretty nice, you know, but she wanted me to write about it. And that really pissed me off, right? I was like, because I don't really write about mean shit that white people do. I mean, I have other concerns, you know? I mean, my other concerns are obviously grounded in the atmosphere that emerges as a function of mean shit white people do, but I'm trying to but what I'm interested in, what I like to write about is anything that might undermine the conditions under which they get to keep doing mean shit, you know? So it's a subtle difference, but it's a real one to me. And it's like, no, that's personal, you know? That's between me and the cops, and it's already over, and I already lost. You understand? Anyway, so I was like, really, you want me to write? How much more? You know, what more do you want to get? You know, what do you want to get from me today? So I'm really in a bad mood. And I get there, and it was the beautiful, and the first person that I see was my friend Jose Munoz, who's, you know, a great, you know, cultural theorist and critic who was a colleague of mine in the performance studies department at NYU, and we were friends for many, many years. And all of a sudden, and then I got out, and the sun was shining, and the trees, these big, huge, like elm trees in the yard of the projects were swaying in the wind. It was like August in New York, so you know it was supposed to be disgusting, but it was like 77. You know, it was beautiful. It was like, if you remember that old Fresh Prince and Jazzy Jeff song, Summertime, it was like that video, right? And they were cooking this food in the restaurant, and it was like, it was such a beautiful day that it kind of made me, my wariness and my skepticism about that project disappeared, okay? And I began to imagine that maybe the dilemma that emerged immediately for me was, why is it that Hirshhorn is insisting on the fact that what he's making is a work of art rather than a social space, right? That's the question that has I don't want to say haunted me, but it's been nagging at me since then. I wrote, and I did write something. It wasn't only glancingly, not even that, about LAPD, but I want to read you what I wrote, and I'm interested in trying to move in this first instance from monument to project, and then I want to move back to some sense or some notion of memorial, and that's where Fela will come in, okay? And at the end of it, I hope I will have said something about or relevant to architecture. The Gramsci Monument. If the projects become a project from outside, then the project's been a project forever. Held in the projects, we the project they stole. We steal the project back and try to give it back to them. Come on, come get some of this project. We protect the project with our open hands. The architect is in mining and we dispossess him. We protect the project by handing. Let's bust the project up. Let's love the project. Can the projects be loved? We love the projects. Let's move the projects. We project the projects. I'm just projecting the project's mind to give away. I'm not mine when I dispossess me, I'm just a projection. Projection's just us, that's who we are, that's who we be. We always be projecting, that's all we have. We project the outside that's inside us. We the outside that violates our block. We violate the auction block experiment. We pirates of ourselves and others. We the friend of all. We the cargo. Are you my treasure? You all, sorry. We the cargo. Are you my treasure? You all I need. Are you my wish? Come be my sunship. You are my starship. You meant to fly, but don't be late. I dream the sails of the project from the eastern shore. Plywood sails, the city island, past the enclave mirror till the bricks arise. At the fugitive bar and the food be tasting good. Kitchenette my cabin and flesh be burning in the hold. I love the way you smell. Your cry enjoys me. Let me taste the way you think. Let's do this one more time while the project repeats me. The project incompletes me. I am replete with the project. Your difference folds me in your arms, my oracle with sweets. Be my confection engine. Hear my plea. Tell me how to choose. Tell me how to choose the project I have chosen. Are you the projects I have chosen? You are the project I choose. So the reason why I thought it might be okay to read that poem today is because I found myself over the last couple days in preparation for this really thinking about project, and more specifically trying to ground myself in some history that I might have had of thinking or speculating a little bit about architecture. And one of the first books that was explicitly in the history of architecture that I ever read was the great Italian Marxist architectural historian Manfredo Tafuri, a book called Architecture and Utopia. But what I found, sort of digging around and thinking about it again this morning especially, was that it's actually a pretty aggressively, it's a pretty aggressive mistranslation of the original title. The original essay he wrote in 1969, and you have to please excuse my Italian, would be Progetto e Utopia, right? Project and Utopia. To me, Tafuri was especially interesting because his critique of the very, of the notion and the idea of the modernist utopian project had a broader historical range than we usually would associate with that utopian project, which we usually also associate almost by reflex with a dystopian project that we would associate with fascism. And sometimes that fascist architecture that we associate it with is, the sort of really nasty, vicious monumentalism of certain sort of Eastern Bloc architecture. Like the only time I was ever in the Eastern Bloc, or the former Eastern Bloc, was in Warsaw, Poland. And I remember, and there was this building that was the Ministry of Culture, and it was the freakiest, scariest building I've ever. Have you ever seen a building that made you think that the walls must have been 12 feet thick? Right? Like it was almost as if you could detect the thickness of the wall from outside, in a way that made you say, I'm never going in there. Not unlike this building actually, but even more ominous. Again, usually we associate the idea of, the sort of the danger of a certain kind of fascism, the danger of a certain kind of authoritarianism that's connected to these sort of utopian architectural projects. We sometimes associate it with those Eastern Bloc buildings, and sometimes we associate it, let's say, with the projects, right? The housing project architecture that, the most famous of which maybe would be like the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, or the Cabrini Green in Chicago, and it's, and over the course of the last 30 years especially, going back really more recently to George W. Bush, and remember the ownership society, right? Remember that the moment in which his primary domestic sort of economic policy initiative was to encourage home ownership. And so the way they did that was by shifting people out of housing projects into Section 8 housing and basically destroying these projects, right? And there were pretty interesting longitudinal sociological studies that were done on the life expectancy of people who were removed from those projects. It turns out their life expectancy dipped, right? Because inside the so-called fascist architecture, right, there's all this anti-fascist living going on in ways that probably the person who's the most brilliant and beautiful at describing those sort of modalities of insurgent, sort of insurgent mutual sociality going on in spaces like that is Abdul Malik Simone, who I hope y'all are reading his work on the city and on sort of edge cities. And I mention his name again, Abdul Malik Simone, because if y'all haven't had him here, he should be here instead of me, right now. The reason why I'm thinking of this is because I'm interested in, it brings me back to that moment of the Gramsci Monument. It brings me back to realizing that my fear about how the projects would be put to use and how the people of the projects would be put to use never took into account, right, the already existing insurgent sociality that was there in those projects. And it's a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? A humbling thing to realize that on some fundamental level, Thomas Hirshhorn knew more about that and had more faith in that than I did. Okay, and so when I reflect on my initial reading of what was for me at that moment in English architecture and utopia, what I'm reflecting on is the ways that maybe a certain kind of reticence towards the project that animates Tafuri's work, and rightly so, right? And in a critical historical way that not only takes into account the 20th century history of that problematic sort of political project to which the housing projects like that had been used, but that goes back to the long history of the architectural project's relation to the development of the city, right? Right. The project's relation to the polis as such, but especially in the era of the Renaissance. So what he's allowing us to understand is that this modernist conflation, right, of a certain utopian discourse and a certain dystopian reality is in fact what one would call a modern discourse. Right, that distinction meaning a distinction between something that we could talk about within the framework of a 100-year period, as opposed to the distinction for something that we could talk about over the framework of a 500-year period. Right. Okay. So, what I'm interested in is how it is that the project might be reconfigured in such a way as to challenge architecture's constitutive relation to the emergence of the city, right? That the project, especially in what one might call the outskirts or the underside of the city, are these places where the emergence of the city as a zone of political control is broken by a kind of metastatic growth of the city, right? The city's sort of weird excess of itself in these zones and spaces like that. And what was really interesting about the architecture, the sort of building, the additions that Hirshhorn created in the forest houses, was that they grew up out of the ground and in attachment to the buildings and walkways, almost as a kind of, well, the term I want to use is something akin to a kind of architecturally cancerous growth, right, onto those spaces, right? It reminded me of this time when, for a minute, my family and I thought we might be moving to the Bay Area, so we decided to look at houses, and it only lasted a day because that was all it took for us to realize that we couldn't afford to live there. but we went and saw this one beautiful house around Lake Merritt, if anybody's from Oakland and you're aware of that city. And it was one of those houses where it was listed as a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. But when we went in, it was a house that had clearly, it was as if the house had a problem, that that the house had continually burst out of its own seams. Okay? It was a house in which a new kind of vernacular architecture had been built on the spot by the people who lived in that house. And that new vernacular architecture was always in response to some sort of familial shock. One shock might be the birth of a baby. Oh, my mother had a stroke and she needs to live with us now. And you could see it in every room they added. Okay. What it created, you understand what I'm trying to get at? This sort of, it was as if the house were overcome by a kind of cellular overgrowth that it couldn't, right? That the organism of the house was disrupted, right, by its own, and it was as if what Hirshhorn did was to create a similar sort of structure with the projects, right? They bursted out of themselves on the outside in the same way that I think the projects had always been bursting out of themselves on the inside, right? That the sort of carceral containment to which the people who had been relegated to the project and to which they were supposed to have, in a certain sense, exceeded, there was something that had always been in excess of that carcerality. Okay? And he figured out a way to make that excess, right, to make that extra growth actually sort of manifest itself on the outside. Okay, so what's this got to do with Fela Kuti? Okay. So when I first accepted the invitation to come here, I wrote this thing. And I decided that what I wanted to do was to try to talk about building, and I wanted to also talk about Bildung. I was interested in the philosophical concept of Bildung as a modality of picturing. Bild is the German word for picture, right? I've always been interested in this sort of near homophony and the way that it produces a certain kind of confusion. I've often Bildung is understood because of the use of that word in the larger word Bildungsroman. Bildung is often thought of as a word that denotes development or growth. Okay, and we associate it with novels like David Copperfield or The Sorrows of Young Werther. These stories that tell how an emergent subject comes into its own or comes into his own fully as a subject. Okay, and so I was like, well, Bildung is a kind of building, right, in this respect. But what is important to not lose the sight of and the sense of and the trace of is that Bildung really means picturing, that this fundamental element of what it is to become a subject is that one develops a picture of oneself, a sense of oneself, right, an image of oneself. And in a certain sense, this capacity to image oneself is a necessary sort of prerequisite to what one might call self-possession. It's like you have to have a picture of yourself in order to know yourself and own yourself and gather yourself in a certain kind of way. And so often, housing, property, land, right, imply, to be the ability to be able to stand one's ground, as it were, right, has been so crucial to this notion of picturing, right, of self-picturing. One has a picture of oneself, one has a sense of oneself precisely to the extent that one can be locatable, that one can stand one's ground and own one's ground, right? This is how the construction of the modern normative self is so bound up with what it is to own, to occupy land, to settle, to take up space, right? Okay. And similarly, by the same token, deficits in the capacity for self-construction, deficits in the capacity to establish oneself, to actually achieve a kind of normative subjectivity, are usually associated with the experience of displacement, okay, right? It's hard to be a normative self if you don't have ground to stand on. If you are constantly subject to removal, you can't be a subject, right, who is in a certain sense defined by their capacity not just to stand their own ground, but to make other people move. Okay? And our contemporary conceptions of personhood are still bound up with these things to this day, you know, so I spoke before about losing my religion, so to speak, with regard to art. And some of that has been because it's hard to separate art from this general project of self-picturing. Okay? And it's hard, and one feels the necessity and the desire to separate aesthetic sociality or aesthetic endeavor from this general project of self-picturing, because we recognize that this general project of self-picturing is so bound up with the brutal history of settler colonialism, the Atlantic slave trade, the histories of like organized, state-sanctioned and state-sponsored misogyny, right? But, you know, the building blocks of our political world, right? The building blocks of our political economic existence. Okay? So if you want to tear down those building blocks, it feels like it's necessary to detach oneself from this project of self-picturing, right? Right? Which is, again, a project of self-construction, of self-building. Okay? So a lot of what that poem is attempting to do is to say, man, I'm so happy about being able to have gone to see this Hirshhorn thing, because for a minute at least, it helps to revive my belief in something like in the projects. In this double sense of the term, right? The project of a kind of aesthetic sociality that might, right, shake off that might challenge the building blocks of the political economic reality in which we live. That's our project. That's the project we live in, right? That's the project we extend in the work that we try to do. You know? That, for me, is the project of the Black radical tradition. And at the same time, I'm interested in how it is that it revived a certain faith I had in the project, as in the housing project, as in a mode of collective housing, which somehow manages to shake off or to break through, right, the sort of fascistic carcerality that seems to be ingrained in the very architecture itself. It was as if here, what it means to live in the projects is to be always embedded in a constant revision of the architectural project, right? That's what I was that's what I was feeling so good about that day when the sun was shining and I was hanging out with my friend, okay? I'm having trouble with it again now, okay? I'm having trouble retrieving and finding and maintaining the sense of how it is, right, that people who live out and bear in their very flesh a history of brutal displacement activate displacement as a radical project. Do y'all, I hope I'm making a little, fuck. Amiri Baraka's got this great poem called Return of the Native. And the poem roughly begins, Harlem is vicious modernism, bang clash, okay? And he talks about what he calls, and there's a reference in the poem to what he calls the placement of people. The way he spells placement is PLACE/MEANT, okay? Norbesi Phillip has this beautiful essay that she wrote in 1994, and it's called Displace. It's spelled D-I-S space P-L-A-C-E. Okay? Displace, the space between. Okay? When I say the word displacement, I mean it to be spelled D-I-S space P-L-A-C-E/MEANT. And I mean it to operate in a kind of, hopefully, ruptural resistance and refusal to an ongoing history of displacement, just spelled regular. Okay? The reason for this is because if we know that the taking up of ground, that the occupation of ground is a condition of possibility of a modern self who expresses himself in its most basic and natural ways through brutality, right? If we know that relation to groundedness and self, okay, to the occupation of land, to the improvement of land, to the building on that land, if we know that the relationship between that occupation of space and self only ever leads to brutality, okay, right? Then our liberation struggle can't be grounded in the idea of retrieving that ground, right? It can't be grounded in a recycling of those old ideas of building and of Bildung, okay? That's why it's necessary, against every possible instinct, to say that the history of our displacement places an ethical demand upon us to configure modalities of radical displacement. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? That the history of our displacement places an ethical demand upon us to refuse and to demur at the historical, normative, subjective project of taking a fucking place. Okay? Okay. So that's part of what I thought I was seeing, or what I hope I was seeing. I still hope I was seeing it in the Gramsci Monument. But where I feel like I'm really, really seeing it, or feeling it, or hearing it, is in Fela Kuti's music. Okay, so I'm gonna play a few minutes of this song called "Coffin for the Head of State," and then I'm gonna talk about it for like 5 minutes or so, and then I'll be done, okay? And I'm sorry to go over my time. Okay. I'm gonna kind of try to see if I can break into the middle of it, so to speak, because there's a long, about 8-minute introduction, which is beautiful, but we gotta, you know. Skip ahead a little bit. let me try to fill in a little information. And there's an extraordinary book about Fela by Michael Veal in which you can learn much more about all of what I'm going to say in a minimal way. Coffin for the Head of State is in some ways a kind of an elegy or a memorial song for Fela's mother. Fela Kuti came from an extraordinary family. He was born in the city of Abeokuta in Nigeria. He came to live in Lagos later. He spent a lot of time in the United States, a lot of time in England as a student. His father was a famous school teacher. If you've ever read Wole Soyinka's autobiography, the first volume of which, or the first installment of which is called Ake, The Years of Childhood. Ake is a word that's also used to name that city, Abeokuta. And Wole Soyinka and Fela were first cousins. Okay. Fela's father was a renowned schoolmaster. Fela's mother was an extraordinarily important figure in the development of a specific sort of feminist anti-colonialism in Nigeria in the 1950s. And it was a feminist working class anti-colonialism that was carried out primarily by people who we like to use the term market women to describe these women. It's a great term. I was talking about today in my class in Ithaca with regard to the poetry of Rosamund King, who uses the term. Sylvia Wynter uses the term a lot in her writing. It's important to think through market women. Maybe in the Q&A I can say a little more about that. Okay. What we're talking about are people who live and operate, again, within those, let's say, zones of precarity that Abdul Malik Simone writes about, again, so brilliantly. Fela talks about walking, waka, waka, waka. I move through the country, I see my people, and I cry, cry, cry. What are the conditions that are making him cry? Nepotism, political corruption, right? Militarism in the state of Nigeria. His protest at the sort of house and social space and concert space that he had in Lagos, which was called the Calacuta Republic, right, was a zone of protest against the state, and especially against the Obasanjo regime in Nigeria in the 80s and 90s. Okay. At a certain point, Fela's mother, whose anti-colonial protest and activism persisted after the emergence of the post-colonial state, right? Okay. She came to live with Fela, and when the army at one point basically invaded the Calacuta Republic and burned it down, they beat Fela's mother, and eventually she died. Okay. So this song describes not just the conditions in Nigeria that he's decrying, but it also, at the end of the song, describes the specific assault against his own place and his mother, right? And her death. So the coffin for the head of state is when, at a certain point, in a year or so after, Fela took an empty coffin and took it to the army barracks as a protest, right? Okay. There's a refrain that goes all throughout the song in which he talks about the movement of the people, right? And this movement, this displacement, which manifests itself as walking in the song and as dance, right, is endemic and crucial to what it is that Fela is attempting to do. Okay. Again, it's a thumbnail sketch, and there's much more to be said about it, and I know I'm not doing his work justice, but I can try to talk about it a little more in the Q&A. The last part of this is specifically directed towards my friend, who I haven't seen in so long, Garnett Cadigan, who's here today someplace. Remember when we walked that time in New Orleans? He gave me maybe the two best days. I've had 3 really great days in my life. I've had more, but 3 that I can think that come to me right now in a way that's kind of like the Gramsci Monument Day. One was a walking tour that an architect friend of mine actually in Germany gave me, like a walking tour of Berlin. all day. It was like back when I could walk all day without too much pain. And it was kind of a glorious day. My old friend Bill Corbett, who used to teach here at MIT, gave me a similar walking tour of the Village in Soho in New York one time. And Garnett gave me a kind of walking tour of New Orleans. There was some driving mixed in too. Okay. It reminds me of a beautiful essay that Garnett wrote that I just taught last year on walking in American cities, walking while black, walking in New York City, walking in New Orleans, but also walking in Kingston, Jamaica. Okay. What I'm interested in under this rubric of displacement, okay, is modes of insurgent sociality, okay, which are predicated in the first instance not on building, not on occupying ground, okay, but on activating movement. Okay. I'm trying to take as literally as I possibly can those iterations of the phrase movement of the people when, and so here's my question to you, just in closing, okay. Because I love to look up the etymology of words, and I thought I knew where architecture came from. I'm always thinking about the Greek term arche, which is usually sometimes translated as ground, sometimes translated as first, right, as source, okay. But there's also the insidious formulation archon, right, which is also part of architecture. It's embedded in the figure of the master builder, the archon as leader, right, and the leader is the notion of first, right. I think about this all the time with regard to poetry, right. How can the insurgent social force and the insurgent aesthetic force of poetry detach itself from a mechanism in which that insurgent social force is filtered through a singular figure? Can poetry be saved from poets? Okay. The question for architecture is more tricky. It's not so much can architecture be saved from architects, okay, but can architecture be displaced, right? Is there an architecture, can there be a radical architecture of displacement in that other spelling that an architecture of movement, okay? Forgive me if it's a simple question, and forgive me if it's a question that y'all have all been thinking about. I imagine you have, but maybe, I hope this is a change of pace, but if it's not, then forget, it'll be over soon and no one will be the wiser, right? And I hope the question, if it's a familiar question to you, then I'm glad it is. If it's an unfamiliar question, then I hope it at least makes sense, right? I hope I've justified it in some minimal way, right? But again, can there be an architecture of displacement? Okay. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Moten, for that amazing lecture, and I think it left us a lot to think about in terms of not only displacement, but in terms of community, communal thought, the sort of binary between utopia and dystopia, and how sort of housing or the way we live plays a role in it. I just want to start by going back to this example of the Robert Taylor homes that you mentioned, especially in relation to the line from your poem, which says, "The outside is inside us," and this idea that the physical doesn't reflect the internal or the sort of insurgent practices happening inside the place. Mostly because we cannot see it, right? There's no evidence. This idea of the visual as the master sense does not exist in sort of like the project, or it needs to be reimagined in the project through new methodologies. but I also want to go into the history of the Robert Taylor homes and how they were dismantled in Chicago, and then people were sort of pushed to the outskirts of Chicago, and then in that way, the outside becomes sort of shiftless. It becomes a place where the growth becomes cancerous in a way that not many people support in the city, right? Or in a way that is, or cancerous in a way that's not benign, but that is, I guess, cancerous. So I wonder in this model that you talk about in terms of displacement and in terms of these insurgent practices, if you're also thinking about iteration and how when these places become dismantled and they move, how can they be built up again? How can the sort of utopian project be one that is not rooted physically in a place, but one that is able to kind of shift from place to place and then be built up again? And I'm thinking about sort of like the project of the favelas in Brazil, et cetera, and how in kind of US cities, it seems that this sort of act is something that's has a lot of pushback. Mm-hmm.
Well, so the house that I was thinking about that we saw that time in Oakland, that was a house that the owners of that house could expand and could also at the same time subdivide as a function of their ownership. But even then, they were doing it surreptitiously and against the law, outside, off code, like out of code. They didn't have permits, okay? And it got me to thinking about these pretty intense, forms of legal regulation that are placed on people, even with regard to how they want to, if you want to paint your house a certain color in certain kinds of neighborhoods, there's these intense kind of interdiction against, let's say what one might call sort of auto-architectural insurgency, right? People can't be their own architects, right? It feels to me like it's an oppressive kind of burden. Obviously, it's even more oppressive when people are living within these sort of rent regimes, like with the Robert Taylor homes. But here's the thing, their capacity to take an already given displacement and turn it into another sort of radical displacement was totally interdicted by the fact that they just got displaced, right? And there's two different ways to think about what it might be for people to build a life in common. And some of that building has to do literally with architectural matters, adding a room or putting up a wall, creating, re-articulating the space, right? But what they did in building a life in common was also in these more intangible ways. Like, for instance, one story I read in one of these sort of sociological studies about life expectancy in the projects would be if you went to look for a job, but your phone had been cut off, in the projects, you could give them your neighbor's phone number so that your neighbor would call you when the job called back, maybe to get, but when you don't have a neighbor, because you're out in Bolingbrook, Illinois somewhere in a Section 8 house, then all of a sudden what you've been extracted from are all these modalities of mutual aid, right? And what we see it in Chicago, we saw it in New Orleans after Katrina, was that these structures of social aid and pleasure, as they would talk about it in New Orleans, were being brutally and drastically interdicted, right? In the interest of creating new modalities, of normative ownership, and all the modalities of self-construction that would go with that, right? The reason why I think about it in terms of a kind of not malignancy, but metastasis is the word I want to say, is because I've had it's because of Octavia Butler, basically. So it's on two levels. Y'all ever read Xenogenesis trilogy? So Dawn and Adulthood. So how can I keep from making this really long-winded? I probably can't. You know, cancer is a major theme in Butler's work, especially in those 3 novels. There are these novels are a kind of post-apocalyptic human society that is being rebuilt by these aliens who are called the Onkali. And the Onkali are these sort of intergalactic gene traders. And they're really attracted to the human sort of genome because of cancer. They are totally obsessed with and attracted to human capacity for let's say, for runaway cellular reproduction, which is what cancer is. Okay. And so this is a trait that they want to acquire and to manipulate and to hopefully render non-lethal, but they're attracted to it. Part of the reason they're attracted to it is because of their own biological endowment. They travel through space in this huge organic ship. And the main character is this human woman named Lilith Ayapo. When Lilith is awakened, she finds herself in a room in this organic ship, and the room is manipulable at the level of touch, right? An enzyme might pass from one person who touches a wall to that wall, and all of a sudden the table rises from it. Okay. And then the table might rise from it, and then a bowl will appear on that table that rises from the table, and then food will be in that bowl. And what you realize is the entanglement of the actual material of social space, the material of this articulated social space emerges as a function of a certain kind of controlled biological growth. Okay. I know that people can't build a new room by touching a wall. I know that human beings can't touch the floor or step on the floor and have a table come up. But I am interested in the ways in which, particularly with regard to Black social life, that kitchen tables are prepared, as it were, right? And I mean it in a sense it is one part biblical and another part Barbara Smith and another part Carrie Mae Weems, right? The preparation of a table for social space and for social building, right? Right? That's how people make space. And or a better way to put it is, it's these modalities of, like shared displacement that is actually that is made as a function of a kind of social poiesis that people are involved in, always under specific and sometimes brutal political economic regimes, but also always under the aegis of their own desires, right? And that's what I'm interested in. I don't want to try to be sort of hyper romantic about it. It's just that an alternative to the state's dismantling of the Robert Taylor homes might have been a constant, active reconfiguration of those homes, both inside and outside, as a function of a kind of architectural insurgency, right? And again, it's Hirshhorn's project that gives me, this sort of inkling of it. And what I'm imagining is, what if people had just decided to rebuild the projects, okay? Or to build on to the projects? How might they have been given support in doing that, right? It could have been brutal. It would have been brutal. There's no huge tradition of squatting in the United States, because the police will kill you about that shit here, okay? But I'm interested in what it would mean. What it would mean for us to begin, as part of a general social project, to actively engage in both the metastasis of our own social spaces, of our lived spaces, right? To literally to share the architectural imperative. That's the question. So Did I answer you? I don't think I answered your question.
At this point, we'd like to open up the questions from the audience. We won't be passing around the mic, but there is a mic stand towards the back, so feel free to get up and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Fred, for coming. And I guess I'll take it from you, so I apologize. This is a very simple question, but I'm thinking about my family back in Ecuador, especially in Esmeraldas. And every time we're on WhatsApp call, they always ask me two things. It's like, what's MIT and what are you doing? And I tell them, like, I'm pursuing architecture. That's what I'm doing here. And sometimes the question leads up to, what is that? And I tell them, it's design. We make spaces. We do these things. And they're like, oh, why do you need to get education for that? I do that. I just like built this shed outside. It's really nice. You should see the window and all that. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is like, especially in what you just answered to Jola's question, is like, how would you define what an architect is, or even, I guess more broadly, a designer? Because sometimes it feels like that term is just a waste of time to an extent.
Okay. No. Okay. Can I tell you a story? Okay. So. I had this chapbook of poetry. It's called Arkansas. It's like the first publication of poetry that I ever did. It's in 2000. And so I was, happy about it, and I sent it to my mom, and she called me on the phone about a couple months after I sent it to her, and she was like, she said it like, I never did like literature. She said it like that. She's like, I don't know how come people can't just say what they have to say, And she was like, and but I'm trying to read it. I'm trying to read what you sent me, but what are you doing? What are you saying? What are you doing? It was kind of variation on your parents' question, I think, She's like, what are you doing? And I said, okay, well, Mama, turn to page like 23, And she was like, I said, okay, you see that line at the last line? She's like, yeah, I see it. She said, I don't know what you're talking about though. I was like, Mama, you said that. You said it, okay? And it was interesting because it was as if she had understood her own relation to, I feel like since I'm at MIT, I have to say the sacred words, Noam Chomsky, but her own relation to what Chomsky would call the creative aspects of language use was that it didn't have anything to do with poetry, right? And you gotta understand, she was completely committed to her own creative language use. And not only that, I grew up around people who were utterly committed to the notion that they were creative users of language at the highest possible levels, right? They knew themselves to be extraordinary manipulators of the language. So why is it that this thing that she was doing all the time and which I was trying to do in my so-called poetry, but it was unrecognizable to her, even if she had said it, okay? And that's been nagging at me for 22 years, So here's what I'm thinking about it right now, at least. So when I went back and I was looking at the Tafuri the other, day, and I was like, oh, it's progetto, not arch, And I started thinking, well, what? I started thinking about, I love the online etymology dictionary, and I found out that, among other things, And I started thinking, well, shit, I wonder, because there's an Italian translation of the undercommons. And I was like, what word did they use? And it's, because it's, you know, fugitive planning and black study. I wanted to know, what word did they use for planning? And I can't speak Italian. Pianificazione. Pianificazione, right? That's the word for planning, okay? And I was like, piana, what's that? Piana, what happened to the L? That's weird, that's interesting, you know, in the transition from English to Italian. But piano is from the same root, right? The key concept is flatness, right? Okay. Planning has to do with, it's what it is to lay a visual image of what you're going to do flat on a table, right? Right. In other words, there's this real sense in which what makes an architect is the plan. Okay. It's an interesting thing, right? What's the relationship between planning and improvisation? That's one question, right? Actually, the word piano comes from this same root too, okay? I know it sounds like I'm crazy, but I'm not. And it's connected to your, I mean, I am, but it's connected to what you're, okay. What if the thing that really makes you an architect is that you can draw up plans, and that those plans can operate within a more general plan, right? And that more general plan is both a state plan or a city plan. It's a political plan. It's a plan of political economic development, okay? But it's also something like a metaphysical plan about the development of human history and the development of the subject, right? Because we know that a whole lot of what it also means to be a normative subject is that you are capable of planning, capable of foresight, okay? Improvisation means the absence of foresight, okay? Okay. Now, but it's the flatness that I'm also interested in, right? What's the attitude that one has toward a plan, right? How does one situate oneself in relation to the plan that one draws up? You can look at it as if it were on a wall, but in general, what you're looking down on the plan, right? The attitude of the architect is one of the overview. Planning is all bound up with overview here, right? Okay. A kind of, you occupy a spatio-temporal position which allows you to see what's going to happen with this plan and allows you to locate everybody within the framework of that plan, okay? As opposed to, it seems to me, a more kind of what one might call vernacular or improvisational architecture, which it's not that it's not about planning, okay? But there is what one might call a fugitive plan, okay? And that plan is structured not by the attitude of the overview, right? But by a kind of involvement on the ground, okay? And that involvement on the ground is one that is primarily characterized by displacement, okay? Right? So, yeah, I just went and built the room. I built an addition, right? When people do that, what are they doing, right? They're adding on to the space they have, but just as often, it seems to me, they're cutting up the space that they have, right? They're creating these really amazing instances of subdivision, right? Which are all predicated on the idea of sharing. And often, those subdivisional modalities of sharing are kind of constantly disrupting normative conceptions of privacy. Y'all tell me if this sounds right, okay? Because the house I saw in Oakland that time, right? The thing that got me was, there was the original house that was sort of normatively constructed, but the additions created a situation in which there were no more hallways, right? Let me ask y'all a question. What's the function of hallways? Okay. Is movement, but you could move from one room to the other in this house, okay? Huh? What if, see, and I think this is a Samuel, no, sorry, I hate to be that kind of motherfucker, like I have the answer to the question. I didn't mean it. See, you're such a good student. You're like, don't indulge that kind of, you should hit me in the head with something. But like, Delaney writes about this in the Nevarian series, right? And I hope I'm not getting it totally wrong, okay? One way to think about please tell me if this is stupid and I'm wrong. I'm happy to be wrong, you know? I think that one of the major functions of the hallway is privacy. What a hallway allows is an individual entry and exit into a room. What a hallway means is that I don't have to go through your room to get to my room, right? Okay. So part of what I'm interested in, right, are how these sort of alternative modes of architecture are not in the first instance constructed by already given understandings of the necessity of privacy. Okay. Because, and hallways, it seems to me, produce eruptions at the level of scale. They take up space. We say they facilitate movement, but they don't just facilitate movement in an abstract sense, do they? They facilitate particular kinds of movement. Okay? They make it so that you can have your space. Okay? Now, what's the political economic history of having one space? And I'm not saying this as a person who is so happy about giving up my space. It annoys me, okay? Like, I got kicked out of the office that me and my partner share, and now my office is in the corner of the living room, okay? And I don't like it most of the time, but sometimes it's cool, because interesting shit happens. And my son starts dancing, you know, I mean, if you've ever seen me on Zoom, you know, there's a shadowy figure behind me, and it's my son, and he's dancing, doing laps through the apartment, and everything's in the buzzer rings, and I got to get up to answer the. Do you understand? What I'm saying is, okay, all of these constitute disruptions of privacy. Okay, how much of the normative ways in which we think about architecture are predicated on the preservation of these modes of privacy? And the relation between those modes of privacy, and again, I use this fucked up word all the time, normative construction notions of Bildung, right? These are totally speculative questions. I'm happy to be wrong. Like, I wish somebody would do me the kindness of telling me that what I'm saying is stupid, because then I won't try to go say it again. But I'm interested. My sense of it is that my mom was saying, well, maybe what she was saying is, yeah, it's not that I don't think that cool thing I said was cool. It just never occurred to me that it needed to be placed in some new modality called a poem, right? She was saying it's part of the way in which we share language, and we do that on the ground, right? Okay, and you wanted to make a work of art out of it, she was saying, you know, and I don't know, and somehow when you made a work of art out of it, it was as if it was taken from me. You know, I can offer just as nasty a critique of everybody else's extractivism as anybody can. I can do that. It's a little bit harder to offer a critique of one's own extractivism, right? An extractivism that is produced in the interest of a certain exaltation of where one comes from. I want to write this beautiful poetry about the way people speak in my neighborhood. I want to write a beautiful poem about my mom so the world will know how great she is. And she's like, who? What is that? You see, so yeah, I'm left again to say, yet again, I don't think I really answered your question, but this sucks. I'm sorry. I wanted to come, you know, so I came, but it's too much to ask. It was a long drive. I'm incoherent.
You're not incoherent. I can confirm.
I don't know if I'm going to make any sense, but
Why begin now?
Exactly.
You know, I mean,
it was an extraordinary lecture. I heard of you for a long, long time, and I'm very honored to be here. I just wanted to ask you if what you're suggesting is to rethink subjectivity in light of all the work you have done. And the question is, who starts? Is the architect help transform subjectivity, or subjectivity has to be transformed first before the architect can think the way you propose. Because the structure of subjectivity is, of course, as you say, normative. And this notion of privacy is very Western and very much what we live every day. And the question is, how do we start the fight so that the concept of subjectivity, I happen to be a Lacanian psychoanalyst, I'm sorry to tell you that. But the notion of subjectivity is something that speaks to me a lot. So how do we deconstruct the notion of subjectivity and the notion of misrecognition and the notion of, this sense of wholeness that we're craving for, to understand that in the cracks we have inside us and our vulnerability is really what connects us to others and make exchange much richer. Yeah. So how do we create a space where the question of subjectivity and breaking down subjectivity and architecture can relate?
So sometimes I get into this horrible, whatever, habit, of like making up words. I think of it as a shorthand, but it's also maybe like a kind of poetry thing. And the word that I made up this morning, which is, it's a horrible word, is toposcarification. So what's that mean? And it's been, and please correct me the minute I say something that's incorrect. The thing, I tried to write a little bit about Lacan in the break, and I was interested in these ruptures and fissures of the subject, and I was trying to write about Lacan in relation to, I wanted to see if there were a way to flood, to fill that particular psychoanalytic endeavor back up, to fill it up with what it had tried to empty out, which was, the phonic substance of language, right? Sound. I wanted to reverse the reduction of non-meaning, because it felt like non-meaning would be the condition that would accentuate, and bring into relief those fissures that open up the possibility of another kind of sociality. And now I've begun to think that maybe there's another thing even within the framework of Lacan's formulations that is also already doing this work, but I don't know how to talk about it, because it seems like he didn't know how to talk about it, except to say that he didn't know how much we could actually talk about it, and it's the real, right? So when I think of this notion of a toposcarification, right? Like that's how I think of. So when I was thinking about the Octavia Butler, what would it mean to touch a wall, and so that the wall would, in a certain sense, scar itself, right? This amazing keloid growth would emerge from the wall that one could then sit on, right? That's the scarification that I meant, like it would produce these it would produce these disruptions of the flatness of the plan, right? That the flatness of the plan would be subject to all these, epidermal eruptions, right? That would become features that we could sit on or lean on or eat on, or I started reading all this stuff about rammed earth, because I thought, could that be a way, And then I was like, no, I don't know, probably not, And there's something about rammed that just freaks me out, I was supposed to, somebody asked me to write something about it, and then I just couldn't do it, because I couldn't get I couldn't see that. I couldn't see, it wasn't doing it felt like what one wanted was something that was more fabric-like, more textural. But the point is, it's this turbulence, a kind of an architecture of turbulence, right? An architecture that sought to be moved, right? A moving, and moving in an affective sense as well as in a sort of whatever, spatial sense. I don't know if any of that is compatible with the subject, but you know what it is compatible with? It's compatible with whatever it is that we are, that we use the term subject to describe. Okay. I don't know if it's compatible with the subject, but my sense of it is that it would be compatible with the richness and the constant proliferation of our differences. That's what I think. I don't know that, I believe that much of architecture is predicated on the idea that an articulated space is needed for the subject to come into his own. And this would be an architecture in which that would not be the primary project. Okay. But that's okay, thank you for the question. I'm thinking that maybe that was almost coherent, semi-coherent. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for speaking to us today. And thank you everyone for coming. Especially thank you for the warmth and grace in which you shared the thoughts that you shared. And I can definitely confirm that you spoke about architecture.
Okay.
No question there. I think we can know you did for sure because of the series of contradictions you provided, or at least complicated pairings. Permanence, movement, a cancer that repairs. But yeah. And I have to announce the next lecture. So the next lecture, I'm just going to read the script. We hope you will join us again in the next lecture series event in the Department of Architecture on March 17th at 6 p.m., as we will welcome Xiaoji Chen in their lecture on Our Own Legacy, presented with the Computation Discipline Group. For a full list of upcoming lectures and events, please see our website, architecture@mit.edu. We hope to see you again soon, both virtually and in person.